Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those who are in different parts of the world, and welcome to Insignia's latest webinar. It's just gone past the hour, and so we'll make a flying start into this week's webinar. Thank you again for joining us. And today I will be joined by Dennis Flynn. First of all, for those of you who don't know me, a quick introduction to me, and then I shall introduce you to Dennis and ask him to say a few words about his background. But I'm Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We are a specialist crisis management consultancy. We help leaders of businesses around the world to plan, train, rehearse, and sometimes handle the worst days of their lives. So I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon, and also to introduce you to Dennis. Dennis was originally an officer in the British Army, which clearly is an ongoing crisis management mode. He was also, though, the founder and chief executive of a very successful crisis management consultancy, and latterly has studied and done research from an academic perspective into some really fascinating topics like personal resilience, how to maintain crisis team performance, and applied positive psychology. So I'm really pleased to have Dennis joining us. And Dennis, maybe just tell us a little bit more about your background beyond that potted history I've just given.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to talk with you and to discuss the topic today. So, as you rightly said, I've already had 3 careers. So the first one was as an army officer. I spent 30 years doing that. Seems an age ago now. Spent 30 years doing it, and my main focus of activity was on anti-terrorism and international crisis planning and management. And amongst the jobs I had was Deputy Director of the UK's Defence Crisis Management Centre, and my final appointment was leading the training organisation for anti-terrorism for the UK Army. And I then left the Army and quite soon set up Crisis Solutions and Crisis Solutions, and I set up and ran Crisis Solutions for 15 years and worked with governments, government agencies and firms all over the world, and it was a fantastic time. And then at the about the 15-year point, I exited the firm. And, you know, like most people, when they exit a firm, they say, okay, this is going to be great. I'm just going to sit and put my feet up. I very quickly got bored. And one of the things which had fascinated me over the years was why it was that some people in a crisis or when facing adversity seemed able to manage their way through it, and others seemed less able so to do. And the received wisdom at the time was that, and certainly from my time in the Army, was, well, some people have got it and other people haven't, and it doesn't matter what you try and do, that's just the way of the world. And it struck me that that was possibly lazy thinking. So I took myself off to do a master's in applied psychology, looking at the upside of psychology, an area called positive psychology, which is described as the science of optimal human functioning. I did my master's in that, and I looked at the resilience of individuals for my dissertation. And since I did that 3 or 4 years ago, I have been working with organizations and people, either at a group level or at an individual level, on personal psychological resilience and organizational resilience.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dennis. So you will all know the title of this webinar today is the implications of COVID-19 for crisis management planning. And certainly for those of us in the UK, and I know there are many on the call who are not in the UK, but the further restrictions or ongoing restrictions announced yesterday mean that this is sadly another timely session to really use COVID-19 as our launch point. This session isn't all about COVID-19, but it's kind of our launch point. And what we will be covering over the next 55 minutes now is the critical importance of reviewing and learning from your experiences so far, how to get the best out of that process of reviewing and learning, take a look at the immediate and short-term implications of COVID-19 for crisis management, what it means for those of you, and it's pretty much all of you, who are responsible for crisis management within your organizations, but then also take a look at some of the longer term implications, how COVID-19 and what's happened over the last 6 months may change crisis management in the longer term. So we hope to provide a combination of some practical, actionable insights, but also some food for thought as well. So without further ado, let's move into the presentation, but actually with one little further bit of ado, because I always forget this at this stage. Two things. One, please do ask questions. You can post them within the chat or question pane, and we will pick up as many of those questions at the end of the session as we possibly can. And number two, just to confirm that this webinar will be recorded, so you will get a version of it subsequent to today's presentation. So I guess one of the criticisms, and it is an easy criticism, but one of the criticisms of the way that the world, governments and businesses have responded to COVID is that they failed to plan sufficiently well. They failed to recognise that the threat, they failed to put the pandemic plans in place beforehand, and they failed to recognise the situation quickly enough as it evolved. And within this webinar, I hope that it will be a spur and a help for those of you on this call not to fall into the same trap of those organisations maybe that fell into that trap 6 months ago, but to make sure you are ready not just for wave 2, but also for all the other multitude of crises which sadly are still lurking in the shadows. COVID-19 is not the only crisis show in town. I wanted to begin the webinar with a quick poll. So please, when I put this up, if you could vote for me, please, so we get full representation. So I'm now going to bring up the poll. Have you completed a review of your COVID response? The options are yes, not yet, but we have a date in the diary, and no. If you could all please click so we get a nice picture across the entire group. So I'm going to give you just 20 seconds to click, and then we'll take a look at the results. Okay, I think we're just waiting for a couple more people to click. Great, I think we're literally down to 1 or 2 people. I'll give you 5 more seconds and then we'll. Okay, so Dennis, I was a guest on a webinar last week, and the host of that guest played this game on me, so I'm going to return the favour. What percentage do you think at this stage have completed a post-crisis review? Not that it's post really, but how many have reviewed their response to COVID, would you guess?
Thank you, Jonathan.
I know. Well, I had it done to me, so I thought I would share the experience with you too. Not that it was you that did it to me, so that's very unfair.
I would say that having completed a review would be in the minority.
Interestingly, it is 50% yes, 25% not yet, but we have a date in the diary, and 25% no. I agree with you. I think the fact that 50% have said yes and 25% have a date in the diary, so 3/4, at least to some extent, have committed to that, is pretty impressive. And I guess that's because we get a high caliber and a high quality of crisis management and crisis communication professionals on these sessions. I suspect that is the 50% yes and 25% not yet, but we've committed to it, is significantly higher than the general population of business people. Would that be your impression as well, Dennis?
I think so. I think one of the challenges for people right now across the board is to be able to lift their sights from the day-to-day firefighting and adjusting their business practices to changes in government policy.
Yes.
And it's really, really tough to take time out to do a review.
Absolutely, and I guess also because of the nature of the situation, in a way, it's hard to know when to do that review, given it is an ongoing situation. And I guess it's a bit like in a crisis itself. At a certain point, you have to make a decision, although things are still changing. I think with a review, it's a similar process. Even if it isn't the end of the situation, there comes a point at which you need to begin to take those learnings. And I guess that leads me on to my first question. It seems like most of the people on this webinar are already convinced, but from your experience, Dennis, why is it so important to run sessions like these, and what would you say are the key outcomes that people should be looking for?
So could I answer a slightly different question first?
Please.
Because something that you alluded to earlier on about the lost 38 days from when Britain walked into disaster, or the lost 6 weeks from the US, or whatever it might be. I think one of the interesting things, and maybe we might return to it later, is the role of risk registers and the role of that. Because if you looked at the UK's National Risk Register, the UK's National Risk Register had, of course, the flu pandemic as its one of the top risks. And the initial response was based on that kind of modelling. The thinking was around that. And the other thing on the National Risk Register in the UK around disease was a category called emerging infectious diseases, and which is in the end what COVID-19 has turned out to be. But the modelling for that was based on something like Ebola, and the expectation would be that there would be no more than 150 cases in the country. So one of the things I think in terms of why is a review important is to see if pre the event you were looking the right way. So once there are different types of reviews, and I think given that we are still in the midst of this, the kind of review I suspect that most people are thinking of doing or have been doing is the kind of the progress check review. Are we still asking the right questions in relation to our response? Are we still looking the right way? And that's why I wanted to reference the pandemic and the emerging disease conundrum which the government faced. And I'm always reminded at this point of, Jonathan, I think you've heard me talk about this, the failure of the British to hold on to Singapore from the Japanese in early 1942. And the defence of Singapore was based on guns facing out to sea, broadly speaking. His always disagrees slightly. But and of course the Japanese invaded in Malaya and came over land, and they came down, and in the end 80,000 soldiers were captured by a much smaller Japanese force, my uncle being one of them. And after that, Churchill said, apropos, were we looking the right way? He said, my advisors ought to have known, my advisors ought to have told me, and I ought to have asked. And I think one of the things about mid-crisis reviews is about, are we still asking the right questions in order to be able to adjust the approach that we're taking? And then the second type is, the rather more well-known rear view mirror type of
Yes.
review. It's all quietened down, you're back to business as usual, whatever that might mean.
Yeah.
And it's how can we do things even better next time.
And yeah, absolutely. A couple of things to add to that. I was literally reading this morning a very interesting article from Harvard Business Review, which is called 5 Principles to Guide Adaptive Leadership. And they're very much talking about this. They're talking about the kind of sentiment that you've just mentioned, Dennis. For example, within there it says, the best adaptive leaders have recognized mistakes are likely to be made and actively use them to identify shared learning opportunities. And I'm also just going to flag up Nick Orwin's comments here on the question pane, where he says, we've set a rolling review of our response, but we are clearly still in the middle of the crisis. We won't know everything until we're at the end and have some peer reports to benchmark against, which again, I think echoes your thinking, Dennis. And I think it's absolutely right. We clearly are not at the point at which we, as you described it, Dennis, look in the rear view mirror, but neither should we be waiting right until the end of this situation to examine what's going well, what's not going so well, what have we learned, how do we recalibrate. So I think that's a useful bit of insight already. Anything to add there, Dennis, or shall I move us on?
No, I don't think so.
Excellent. Okay, so I did want to take a look at the structure for a review session, and I think the fundamental structure of this works whether you are mid-crisis or at the end of it. And by the way, just before I do move on, one blindingly obvious thing that I'm sure is already embedded with the way that you do manage issues, incidents and crises now is to note down learnings, flaws, things that have gone really well, areas that you would like to do even better as you encounter them during the crisis. I say it sounds really obvious, but a lot of organizations understandably are so focused on dealing with the situation that they neglect to contemporaneously note down the things that they've learned as they're going along. And then when you look back at it, a week, a month, 3 months, 6 months later, you've actually missed a lot of that richness, which would have been really useful. So just a tip that if you're not already doing that, please make sure you record learnings contemporaneously. So a structure for reviewing your COVID response to date. And Dennis, I know this is a structure that you have used over the years. Maybe if you could kind of briefly walk us through it and why this is a good structure for evaluating and learning.
Absolutely. And is the next slide up? Sorry,
it is. Sorry, so it's the...
For some reason I can't see it right now. So if we look back at the classic way of tackling a post-incident or post-crisis review is there are the 3 questions: what went well, what went badly, what would we do differently? And that was absolutely fine as a start point. But it seemed to me, as I was looking around for a model which was perhaps more nuanced and more insightful, that just those 3 rather blunt questions maybe didn't provide the granularity that executives and crisis managers and crisis leaders might want. And inevitably, as someone ex-military, I looked at the ways that the military do these things. And this model is taken from the American after-action review approach. And their idea is to ensure that you build on the best of what you did. If I think about doing after-action reviews in the old way, you end up with a red, amber, green, a RAG report. If there are 20 categories, 19, let's say 10 or 11 are green, 3 or 4, maybe 8 or 9 are amber, and 1 or 2 are red. What is it everybody focuses on? They focus on the red, rather than looking at how can we leverage all that good stuff in the green so that the red is less bearing down on us. And the way the Americans therefore approach this is that they look at things, and what the way that I've worked with this over the years is, what did we want to happen? I mean, it's a really obvious thing. If you start the process, where do we want to be by now or at the end of the process? And of course, Jonathan, as you and I have discussed in the past, this leads to the crisis management structure of setting the intent. Where do we want to end up? What does good look like? What's our picture of success? So in a sense, one is a definition of what did we want to happen. And then question two looks at, well, what actually happened? And that's with a degree of granularity as well. Not that we failed or we succeeded, but what actually happened as the process went through. I'll return to the difference between these questions in a second. The third one is, why did that happen? What got either us to achieve what we wanted to achieve or not quite get there? Were we optimal or suboptimal? And then the final one is not what will we do differently next time, but what will we do next time? How will we build on our strengths and so on? The first two questions are essentially facts. They should be knowns. And so as part of the review process, I think one can make an argument that this ought to be fairly well documented, to your point about keeping score as you go along. And also, what did we want to happen? The why did it happen and the what will we do next time questions are a matter of judgment and a matter of opinion. And the why did it happen question, I think, is particularly interesting because there are various approaches for getting to why did things happen, and people talk about root cause analysis and so on. I have some concerns that sometimes root cause analysis drives to the process end of the crisis management area, rather than incorporating some of the cultural and psychological things. So one of the ways of dealing with why did it happen is an approach which is called the 5 whys. Anecdotally, if you ask why 5 times when someone says something, you're getting close to the reason. And other colleagues may be familiar with something called Occam's razor, which is where there are competing hypotheses. It's normally the one with where you have to make the fewest assumptions and the most simple explanation is more likely to be the one to follow. And then what will we do next time is a matter for discussion.
Yes.
And if one were building a review around this kind of idea, just to give one a sense of, well, how much time do we assign to this? I would say that imagine, let's divide into percentages. What did we want to happen? 12.5%. So it's an hour meeting, 15 minutes, agreement of that's what we wanted to have. What actually happened? Similar kind of time frame, 12.5%. So really, really short. Sorry, my maths were wrong. So those two elements together are about 15 minutes. Why did it happen? 15 minutes. What will we do next time? That's the bulk of the review.
Yeah.
And over the years, I'm about to wrap up this, Jonathan. Over the years, I've seen people spend a lot of time looking at questions 1 and 2.
Yeah. And
not allowing enough time and freedom for people to contribute to question 4.
Yeah. So 2 observations, probably 2 pieces of reinforcement, really. So ultimately, your review kind of isn't a review, it's forward looking, because it's that fourth question that is ultimately the most important, because it is the purpose of the exercise is to do things even better in future. So as Dennis explains, therefore the biggest proportion of time needs to be spent on the forward looking part of it. And I would also observe that from time to time when we have been brought in to run these kind of sessions, organizations find it very hard to answer the first question. And, you know, going back to the beginning of managing a crisis, I would once again just endorse Dennis's point that as you think about the next time you do begin to respond to a crisis, you have to know the answer to that question before you start doing things. Otherwise, you don't have a strategic intent, you don't have a direction, you don't have a purpose. So if you only find out in the review that that wasn't in place, then that is rather unfortunate. So we now know the or a structure for a review meeting. What I want to move on to now is how do we create the conditions for a successful review? And again, having read the article this morning, I just wanted to read a section out of that Harvard Business Review article and then ask Dennis to kind of continue from that. So it says, leaders need to commit to sharing their thinking at every stage, and by acting in such an open and transparent way, set a benchmark for how to engage with stakeholders as the pandemic progresses. More than that, by acknowledging their fallibility, leaders create an environment of candor, psychological safety, and mutual trust that is vital for effective crisis response. So, Dennis, can you tell us a little bit more about how to create psychological safety, please?
I shall try. There is no monopoly of wisdom at this end of the webinar. But, maybe helpfully provide some pointers. People on the webinar, participants may be aware of something called Project Aristotle, which was run at Google. And if I thumbnail that project for a couple of minutes, it sets the scene for psychological safety. So Google, global company, data-driven, looking to create high-performance teams. And what they discovered was that some teams were outperforming others and some teams were lagging. And so they set up a group of people to investigate why that was the case. And they spent about a year or so looking at this. And by the way, for participants, I think if you Google Project Aristotle, ironically Google it, if you dive into that, you'll find more detail than I'd like to give you. So they looked at the makeup of the teams, they look at the tasks, they look at all the kinds of things, and there were no common denominators. And it was quite frustrating, having had lots of bright people looking at this for a year or so. There were no common denominators. So they then asked the questions a slightly different way. They then asked questions about behaviours. And they discovered that the teams which were performing best and therefore contributing in the most open way were teams where people were encouraged to speak, where their contribution was valued. Their contribution was not hierarchically based, and where people felt able to speak up without fear of embarrassment or being disregarded. And I think that's particularly important for reviews, because it may well be that one of the newest hires in the company has the most insightful thing, because he or she is the newest hire of the company and therefore is not conditioned by how things ought to be or what's gone on before. And the way in which leaders and what one might therefore say people conducting reviews can do this is by acknowledging the uncertainty of the situation, acknowledging their fallibility, and themselves asking, questions all of the time. In other words, being curious.
Yes.
But before I finish on this bit, some things, people often say, well, what's the difference between psychological safety and trust? And it's a great question, and academics and researchers argue about this, but it seems to be that psychological safety is an atmosphere and a culture that one can create. And people, it doesn't need a significant amount of time to build up trust between individuals, where you get to know someone and you develop that trust because you know that you can always rely on them and so on. Whereas psychological safety can be a culture, a stated intentional culture. Yes. And so it's something that you can do right now.
Yes. Yes, and I think it is, it ties together two of the things that you've been talking about. It's leadership, but it's leadership in not the conventional sense of it. It's leadership in the sense of leaders being comfortable to show their own vulnerability, fallibility, them being open about uncertainty. And I think that's something that has been very much to the fore during the COVID-19 situation, that leaders who tried to communicate certainty came unstuck, whereas those that I think showed themselves to be a little bit more vulnerable and say, look, I don't know exactly what's going on, I don't know how the world's going to look next week, but for now, this is the decision that we're going to make. And so I think role playing, or rather role modeling, your own vulnerability as a leader will enable others to feel comfortable doing that too. How about the concept of growth mindset within a review context, Dennis?
Yeah, that's a great point, Jonathan. I think it's really important. This idea of learning how to be better rather than being defensive about mistakes, and a capacity to deploy a growth mindset to be able to do that. And mindset is essentially a frame of mind which orientates an individual to a particular set of associations and expectations. So, and the global leader of this is a lady called Professor Carol Dweck, and I strongly recommend her book, Mindset. Great book.
Yeah.
And broadly speaking, there are two types of personality mindsets, if you will. There's a fixed mindset and the growth mindset. And the fixed mindset person sees things in very binary terms. You're either talented or you're not. You're either competent or you're not. You're either intelligent or you're not. And they tend to be quite defensive about errors which may have been committed. And they tend to see the telling of a successful narrative as often more important than the delivery of the output itself. Yes. So they need, the fixed mindset person is looking essentially for reassurance that they are as good as they think they are. And what that leads them to, of course, is sometimes to be very defensive about mistakes.
Yeah.
The growth mindset person, on the other hand, is someone who is open to the vulnerabilities that you were referencing,
yeah.
And open to learning. And one of the ways of thinking about this is, how do these mindsets differ? And if one thinks about it in terms of a response to an incident, and let's say it goes not particularly well. A fixed mindset person would go, I'm no good at this, there's no point trying anymore, I just can't do it. A growth mindset person would say, what am I missing?
Yeah.
If on the other hand it goes well, a fixed mindset person would be saying, I'm awesome at this, I'm absolutely brilliant. I'm just reinforcing the fact that I am a genius in this field. And whereas the growth mindset person, and this is to the heart of the review, is what can I learn to get better?
Yeah.
Those are, that's a real high level thumbnail of the differences in mindset, and why trying to encourage a growth mindset is vital to an effective review.
That's fantastic, Dennis. And as we're talking, I am, increasingly recognizing there are some very big concepts and areas that we're covering in a very short period of time. So well done in summarizing it so effectively. So I want to move on to checking in with your team, checking in with yourself, and how we can maintain the performance of the teams that the people on this webinar are represented on, how they can look after themselves as well. Because I know certainly talking with clients over the last month or two, certainly I think in the early stages of this situation there was a lot of adrenaline, there was a lot of passion, there was a lot of feeling of service that people working in crisis management, business continuity and crisis communication were really part of the national effort and were really doing a service to their organisation and their colleagues. I think as we now look to, a further extended period of working in this area, some of that initial enthusiasm, passion, drive, commitment, it would be understandable if that had dropped a little bit, maybe to be replaced with anxiety and trepidation and concern about the coming 3 to 6 months, not just about the situation itself, but one's own ability to continue to operate at those levels. So again, Dennis, I recognise this is a big topic worthy of a whole day workshop rather than a 5-minute answer. But what are some of the things you would suggest individuals or teams should be thinking about if they're starting to experience those feelings?
So, thanks, Jonathan. So I think there are 3 points to make. The first is about how one uses intentionally a mindset approach to the view of stress. So it's been a really stressful time for people over the last few months. High degrees of uncertainty, high degrees of ambiguity. As humans don't particularly handle ambiguity very well. We like certainty. We're hardwired as social animals, and so home working and Zooms and not being able to get feedback from meetings and seeing facial expressions and body language and all of those things, those have contributed to quite a stressful period for people. And I think we've all felt that, whether it's in our professional lives or in our home lives. The death of spontaneity. I read an article the other day where everything has to be planned. And so the first point is about mindset and stress. I think it's about, some people view stress as debilitating. It's all bad. It brings. I view stress as debilitating, and that has impacts on performance, on health, and on well-being, negative impact. On the other hand, some people can view stress as quite energizing and enhancing, because if you think, some people would say, I need a deadline to really be at my best. Yeah. I'm firing on all cylinders when I'm under pressure. So I think recognizing how you view stress and intentionally say, okay, that's my view, and so I therefore might need to just either build on that or just reflect on it to try and adjust that. That's the first one. The second one is about a personal thing, and it goes to the thing about positive emotions, and they are great. They're fantastic for creativity, for keeping energy, and for delivering the best that we can. And it's quite tough at the moment. And so one of the ways when we're feeling a little bit down is we all know things that we do. So as you, Jonathan, know, if I'm feeling a bit, well, I take my dog for a walk. Yes. Or I listen to some particular music that I like. So I've got, and these are called reset buttons. And most people know that they've got these reset buttons, but actually thinking about what your 2 or 3 reset buttons might be, and then when you're feeling a bit low, intentionally saying, okay, I'm going to press reset button, which says, I need 10 minutes of fresh air, because I know 10 minutes of fresh air will re-energize me.
Yeah.
And that's a really straightforward, simple thing that people can do. And then the third and final one is about how to generate, in this quite tricky environment, stronger relationships with colleagues that one might not be seeing every day, and how does one deepen those relationships in order to drive better outcomes. And there are many ways, but one way which I think is quick and easy is something called active constructive responding. And Jonathan, you've heard me talk about this before.
Yeah.
And broadly speaking, we have different ways of responding when people tell us things. And you would think that if someone shares bad news with you, that how you respond to that is a real important driver of the strength of the relationship. And yes, it's important. But what research has shown over the years is how we respond to someone when they share some good news with us is even more important. And I'll explain why in a second. So there are, broadly speaking, 4 ways. There's active and passive, constructive and destructive. So if we take, for example, the passive constructive response to something, let's imagine, Jonathan, that you come and see, you're on a Zoom with me, you say, I just got my cholesterol results and I'm back in normal range. My response to that, passive constructive, could be, well done, Jonathan. Okay, so good effort. What we're here to do today is to talk about how many seats we need for the offsite. So that's passive constructive. Then there's passive destructive. You say to me, I've cholesterol's in range, and I go, Jonathan, that's absolutely fantastic. Funnily enough, my cholesterol's been in range forever. And the way I do this is I eat well, I exercise, it becomes about me. Yeah. And then there's active destructive, which is you tell me cholesterol's back in range, and I say, oh dear, Jonathan, how long was it out of range? Just think of all those things you're going to have to give up. You're not going to be able to eat all those things that you like to eat, and sometimes you have to question, don't you, Jonathan, is it worth doing? So that's active destructive. But the way in which we build on relationships when someone shares some good news is through enthusiastic support. And this is something that you can do right now. And what I mean by that is, that's great news, tell me more. I talked about 5 whys earlier on.
Yeah.
Tell me more. It's a really simple thing. And the way this works in boosting relationships is that because when someone gets some good news to start with, they have a spike of positive emotion.
Yeah.
Positive emotion, good points. By enabling them to relive that, they get another boost of positive emotion, which is good for them. But crucially, what the research says is that you as an individual get associated with that boost in positive emotion. And that's how it works to strengthen, deepen, and increase the longevity of relationships, both at work and at home. And that's something that can be done not just face-to-face, but over Zoom, over a phone call, or however.
Excellent. So find ways to look after yourself. Think about some of those reset buttons. Find ways of supporting, encouraging and reinforcing positive messages with colleagues. And the other thing that we've seen clients find really useful at the moment is actually, before setting off on this next long journey, actually just spending some time together on a Zoom call, reflecting on what you have achieved over the last 6 months, recognize those successes, but also be open in sharing how you are feeling. It is much harder to stay connected as a team, and it's much harder to understand what your colleagues are grappling with when you're not physically present with them. So I do think a formal check-in, if you haven't done it already, right about now with your closest colleagues, who, the people on this call have been right at the front line. It's been difficult for everyone, and I think it's been particularly difficult for those playing the kinds of roles that we have on this call. So do take some time out, do reflect on your successes, but do also listen and work out strategies to deal with some of the challenges that you're feeling as a team. So we're moving into the last 15 minutes. Again, I'd encourage you to post any questions. We've got a couple of areas to go through. I'm going to lead on the next slide before Dennis will be looking at the kind of longer term future of crisis management in the context of COVID-19. So here are some of the short-term challenges, and these are messages and situations that we are hearing about from our clients. And I just wanted to make some observations and provide some insights into what these challenges are and some thoughts on how you can address them. So home working, clearly most of us have been working from home for the last 6 months or more. Again, I was on a webinar last week. The question was asked, how many people are working from home? It was 88%. So the vast majority of people in roles like the ones that we're in are still working from home, and particularly in the early stages, we all know how challenging it was to achieve an effective working environment under those conditions. I guess the question now is, how well would home working, were you to face another big crisis, would you be able to respond as effectively as in the good old days when the team was all gathered together? And I guess my observation on that actually is, yes, there are challenges with working remotely, but were you ever all gathered together in a single room when you were managing a crisis? That's the kind of epitome of a crisis management team, but in my experience it rarely happens, and it's usually, a smaller group of people in a room, often with a number of people dialing in or joining by video conference. And my experience of those meetings is that often those people who were joining by phone on the spider phone or via the video conference, which no one could ever get to work, are very much second-class citizens within that crisis management team, having a less effective grasp over the status of the situation, a smaller stake in influencing or making the decisions. And one of my thoughts, with the new way of working is actually, and when I use the word democratic, I don't mean that, we have a vote at the end of the crisis management meeting, but it's a more equal way of working for a team. And I think because we're working remotely, it will also cause a more disciplined way of working. Again, I've been in crisis management team meetings from time to time where it's been a little bit anarchic with side conversations and conversations drifting off-piste. In a virtual environment, that cannot happen. So my hope is actually that home and virtual working might actually reinforce some of the key disciplines that makes working in a crisis effective. Second thing is crisis fatigue, particularly within the teams, again represented on this call, but also within those who are not crisis specialists. And I was interested to read from a client, Gus Whitcomb, who heads up crisis management at Cathay Pacific. He posted last week, he was up at 1:30 in the morning running crisis training for his colleagues in the Americas. And I think that's really admirable, given that there are not many Cathay Pacific planes flying at the moment, but their commitment to crisis training above and beyond dealing with the pandemic itself is undimmed. And his comment on that LinkedIn post was, crises do not take a break, neither should our preparation efforts. So it's easy to understand and empathize with crisis fatigue. Sadly, those risks, threats and crises that were always there are still there. So we cannot afford to be fatigued. The next challenge, I think, is misplaced confidence in our ability to get through a crisis, based on our COVID response. And I sense this may be, again, talking to a number of people working in crisis management and business continuity, this may more apply to some leadership teams than to the crisis management and crisis communication professionals themselves. The fact that, do you know what, it's been incredibly tough, but we have managed to make it through, and so we will make it through any future crisis. I think one of the reasons why that is misplaced is that COVID is a very particular kind of crisis and a very abnormal kind of crisis. It's slow burn, long lasting, little individual media scrutiny on individual organisations. It's been the big picture rather than any individual organisation, and it's been focused on people, health, workplace, supply chain. There are many different types of crises for which this experience, yes, would be useful and valuable, but I think any assumption that future crises will play out in a similar way and that, you know, exactly how we've dealt with this one will be right, any views along those lines, I think, are misplaced and could cause complacency. Misplaced conclusions. One of the misplaced conclusions, and Dennis kind of touched on it very, very early on, that I am concerned about is, first of all, everybody rushing off and focusing on developing highly complex playbooks on how to respond to a health crisis, a pandemic. And we just need to guard against assuming that the next big crisis is going to be a pandemic. It might be. And more broadly, I think we need to guard against getting too risk or scenario specific in our planning. What I observed in terms of how our clients responded to the pandemic was that those that had a pandemic plan were in a fantastic place. Those that had a good crisis management plan were in a very good place as well, because the tools, processes, principles, ways of working that should be articulated in your crisis management plan should enable you to navigate your way through any crisis situation. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't have checklists or mini playbooks for your high priority risks. I think you should, but please make sure that your organization doesn't go down the line of only developing scenario specific checklists, or even worse, going deep into planning for another health crisis, and then in fact it's a cyber incident that happens next month and you haven't got a playbook for that. Right, I'm going to move on rather than going through blinkered thinking as well, because I am mindful of time. And so, final area of consideration. So we've talked about looking back and reviewing. We've talked about some of the short-term areas to think about. What could be some of the longer-term implications? And I know, Dennis, when we've talked, you've reflected that there are parallels between 9/11 and COVID in terms of what they mean for crisis management planning. Can you just kind of share some of your thoughts and observations on that, please?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, so they seem vastly different, don't they? But I remember on 9/11 working from my home office and watching the horrific events unfold, and shortly after that, I was asked to speak at a conference, and I remember saying that that this event is going to change, for as far ahead as I can see, the way in which we think about security and terrorism and travel. And if one thinks back to the late 1990s and the way that we traveled on aeroplanes, and the way that, I remember, for example, flying on a civil airliner, and I was quite interested to go and join the captain and co-pilot, and I just showed an ID card, and the air stewardess said, "Yeah, come on up."
Yeah.
And since 9/11, of course, the way in which we look at those things has fundamentally changed. And I have a hunch that post-COVID, the way that we will look at public health policy and the way that we look at our duty of care towards our employees and the way in which we reflect on our businesses will not be the same again for as long ahead as I can see. And so I think that if people, I often hear people talk about, well, when we get back to normal, I don't think we are going to get back to where we were before. I think Ernst & Young have using the phrase the next normal, not the new normal, the next normal. And I think that that's going to have a fundamental impact on the way that we think about crisis planning in the future.
Thank you. Again, I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to add one thing to that, and then we have a question. The one thing I'd like to add to that is something, again, that I've been asked on a number of occasions over the last month or so. What should we do about exercising? Should we now plan to run all of our exercises virtually, or should face-to-face exercising still be part of the makeup? And I think my answer to that is that for now, I think virtual exercising is the way to go. It is clear that for the foreseeable future, any crises will need to be handled via a dispersed team, and I do worry about the vulnerability of organisations who haven't properly rehearsed that virtual response. So I think for now, virtual exercising is the way to go. Again, a bit like in a crisis where it's always easy to find a reason not to make a decision, it would be easy to say, let's not resume exercising until we can get everyone back in a room together. That point may be who knows how many months away. And in the meantime, as we mentioned, there are threats lurking out there. So I do hope that face-to-face exercising will form part of your exercising in future again. But for now, I think virtual exercising almost certainly is the way to go. So with 2 minutes left, I'm going to take Nick's question, which is, we have a very defined, exercised crisis plan which sets out the basis of a response, but that would not have been sustainable for the last 7 months. Foreseeing the long likely path of this crisis, our first job was ensuring we could run this on a continuous basis at a different pace to that envisioned. But do you think that this prolonged response was foreseeable and plannable before COVID? I'll give you my relatively short perspective on that, Nick, and it would be that I think the job of any crisis management plan is to get the organisation through the first hours or maybe the first days of a crisis. And I think many of the structures, processes, principles, ways of working in the best crisis management plans and the teams that were grooved on those ways of working really helped those organizations when they first felt the impact of COVID. Things like, as simple as we were talking about earlier on, setting strategic intent, defining what the number one priority for attention was right now, assigning actions and making sure responsibilities and deadlines were clear. I think all of those principles were incredibly helpful as organizations got to grips with the situation for the first time. Did those crisis management plans continue to guide organizations through, weeks 4, 5, 6 and months 3, 4, 5 and 6? No, they didn't, and I don't think it would be reasonable to expect them to do so. So I think your experience, Nick, is probably the same as most of our clients. I would hope that what you had in place were incredibly helpful early on, but I think one of the things we've learned from this crisis is the need to be flexible, nimble, adaptable, and also creative in how we respond. Dennis, at this point, I am going to say thank you so much for your contribution and your wisdom. I think a really rich mix of both, say, practical, actionable insights and lots of food for thought for those on this webinar. So thank you so much for sparing your time on this webinar.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure, Jonathan, as always.
Thanks, Dennis. And for everybody else, thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending where in the world you are. I trust that you found it a useful, valuable use of your time. If you have any questions for myself or Dennis, you have my contact details in front of you, and I can forward any questions specifically for Dennis to him. Please do keep positive. Please do look after yourselves, look after your colleagues, and make sure that despite the ongoing COVID focus, that you are thinking about the broader elements of your crisis management planning, training and exercising, because sadly, things like terrorism, things like cyber threats, they're not only still there, in many ways they are more dangerous now than they were before. So please do continue to look after yourself and look after your organisations. Very much look forward to seeing you for our next webinar. And in the meantime, please have a peaceful and crisis-free afternoon. Many thanks.